Thinking in numbers and shapes and patterns and using interval names is really a toolkit and a vocabulary that gives us a better way to understand music and describe what's happening. Using numbers works for every key, not just one. When we learn things in lots of different keys, it's difficult because it feels like we're learning lots of different languages. But thinking like this can help us translate that into one common language. There's three sort of main things we reference with numbers that it's often useful to think about. The first thing is where we are in relation to the scale or the key that you're using. So just numbering the notes of the scale and keeping track of where things are happening. We can track that with note names too, but when you keep track of that with numbers, then you can see the same things happening inside other scales, the same patterns. The note names will be different every time, but the numbers will be the same every time. And with that, we can also label where we start chords from. The second one is where things are happening in relation to the chord that we're on at the time. So now we can kind of think of a new starting point at the beginning of that chord, and we can use numbers to label the notes in the patterns that we're creating using the notes from the chord, or sometimes the notes around the chord as well. And then if we have a chord progression, we can recreate the same sounding patterns on each chord that we're on. And then we can also just use numbers to describe how far one note moves to the next. So that might be describing the shape of how a melody moves around. It might be describing how one chord moves to the next, or how we voice a chord, how the notes in that chord are spread out. And it more accurately describes how music really works and how we hear it, because obviously the pitch and the range of notes is important, but the relationship between notes and how they interact is a huge part of how we perceive and hear music. Once you're familiar with this kind of vocabulary, musicians use it all the time to describe and make sense of so many things. For me, it really was a big part of unlocking the mystery of how to play music. If you play this in one key, then I play the same thing in another key, I'm sure you agree that although the second one was higher, it sounded like the same melody, the same pattern, just shifted up a bit. All the note names were different though. I started from a different place and it looked very different because we have a mixture of different coloured keys on the piano. So imagine the first one was in English but the second one was in French. They both meant the same thing, but they appear different. But by using numbers, how I'm about to teach you, you can translate those two things into one common language. And that's just a short fragment of a melody, Oh and the Saints, but you can extend that concept to anything. Chord progressions, a whole piece of music, anything. And this is sometimes a much more useful way to think about things and can really have a big impact on your development as a musician. I'm going to get into how to do it in a minute, and there's timestamps in the description if you want to skip ahead. But I know a lot of you want to know why this stuff is important. A lot of beginners may know a little bit about using numbers in music, but sometimes they don't know quite where to implement it or remember to actually use it to their advantage to help them learn. At the beginning, it can be difficult to imagine quite how much this can help and how far it can take you. There's so many things it helps with in the long run, and sometimes you have to experience it for yourself to really get it, but let me quickly mention a few things first. We use numbers and intervals to explain the patterns and which notes build types of chords and scales in a way that works in every key. That means each type of chord and each type of scale has the same spacing of notes and the same intervals. And simply just knowing how to label things helps you get much more familiar with shapes and finding things on the keyboard. You can describe the note choices to create a particular kind of sound on the piano. Maybe it's a riff, a nice voicing for a chord, a pattern you like, or an element of playing piano in a particular style. And it helps you make sense of and actually gives you context for the notes that you're learning when you learn other bits of music. You then have the tools to take that around any key, because learning how to create a particular sound, whether you're writing music, improvising, or even just recognizing things you play, that means being able to do it in other keys as well. This basically teaches you how to find the notes you're after when you are writing music or improvising without guessing. It even just helps you learn and memorize things more effectively because you recognize those things in this common language. Seeing and feeling patterns on the keyboard and labeling those shapes we're making helps us keep up mentally with things, follow the notes when we're reading too. Eventually things start to make much more sense, for example when you can see where things are happening in a scale, because it's like you have context for those notes. And importantly, we use this kind of thing as a vocabulary to help train our ears, because ear training isn't really about learning to memorize the sound of of specific pitches most of the time. Although obviously we do have to match the note on the piano. We train relative pitch, and that means things like hearing how far notes move around, or intervals, the sound of different chords and chord progressions, and where in the scale we are. Essentially, it's easier if you learn how to label those things that you're hearing using numbers, so you can find them again or recognize them when you hear them. It takes a while to actually see these things quickly and comfortably in different keys on the piano, which is why I put loads of emphasis on shapes and intervals and stuff on the channel. But when you do develop that familiarity, things start to feel a lot clearer and start to make a lot more sense. It takes work to get there, and it's also something you'll be forever trying to get better at, but I can specifically remember when an old teacher of mine, a jazz pianist, made me implement this and train my ears and practice things in different keys, and just what an impact that had on how much and how quickly I was able to learn things. Don't forget, when you're much more comfortable finding things on the keyboard, you have to think less hard about that, and then you can focus more on technique. The first level is thinking about where we are in the scale or the key, and we'll keep coming back to just relating between individual notes as we go. The simplest thing to do first to get this is to number the notes of the major scale. If we use C major first, that's just from C to C. The start of the scale we call number 1, and then we just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we start again at 1. When I just played Oh When the Saints, instead of thinking of that as C, E, F, G, let's now think of it as 1, 3, 4, 5. First, third, fourth, and fifth notes of the scale. Now, if I play notes 1, 3, 4, and 5 of any other major scale, I'm going to create that same sound, that same pattern. So if I do that in using the first 5 notes of F major, those notes there, I'm going to get. If I do it in A major, there's the first 5 notes of A major. Now the reason that works is because those major scales to start with are exactly the same pattern or spacing of notes. They all use the same intervals. So because you've got the same thing to start with, you can repeat the same patterns or anything inside of those scales. So like I said, those notes are different each time. The shapes appear different on the keyboard each time, but they are actually the same thing. But to an experienced musician who's thinking in that common language of numbers and patterns, they can see it's exactly the same thing happening inside each scale. So when playing gets busier, we don't consciously think of every number as we're playing. We can use that to analyze things, but as you're doing it in real time, it's kind of like you just see those patterns. You can see where those notes are in relation to the key that you're in. But you can use the odd note here and there as like a reference marker. So just then I was using numbers to describe exactly which notes of the scale I was using, but another way we use numbers is sometimes to describe the movement between specific notes. So O to when would have been a third because it's spanning 3 notes of the scale. And then when to the would be a second because it's spanning 2 notes of the scale. It's moving next door in the scale. And that we commonly use that terminology to describe shapes and how we're moving around. So is it moving around in seconds? Is it moving around in thirds? Thirds being every other note in the scale like that. And then the word the to saints was another second. It's a helpful way to describe how shapes move around, to hear how notes move around, and to see how far notes move when they're written out on sheet music as well. So when people are using numbers, you have to be clear on the context. Are they talking about like the third in the scale, or are they talking about the third between one specific note and the next specific note? So when I played this note to that note, and then this note to that note, that's actually a minor second, and that is a major second. But they're both kinds of seconds, so if we have the context of the scale, we can just say second, and we know that the second up from here is going to be that one, and not the major second, because we know we're locking inside the scale. To keep things simple, we often only use as much detail as we need. These numbers in the scale are really intervals, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 is really a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and so on. But we have the context of the scale. We know we're locking inside that scale, so we don't need to bother saying the whole name every time. We can just use the individual number. But what if we go outside of the scale? Sometimes music uses notes outside of the main key that you're in for various reasons. So if I was to play this, well, we don't have a description for this E flat that I used yet. But this note it's flat below the third note, so we can call it the flat 3. Or we can say the minor third, because if the E is the major third, E flat is the minor third. So if we use one of the notes that goes out the scale, we have to use the full interval name to be specific so we know exactly which note to use. And just to point out, just like this note has two names, it could be F sharp or G flat. Sometimes we might call it the sharp 4 or the flat 5, and you kind of need context to know what to use. There could be lots of different scenarios where you might use either one. I wouldn't worry about that too much just yet because it's going to depend on the situation. So the main important thing to get is that when we have the context of that major scale, we can just use the regular number, and when we go outside the scale, we need to be more specific with the interval name. I'll just quickly recreate that in the key of F. So here I use the root up to the 6th, back to the root, then to the flat 3, and then to the major 3. So in F, that would look like this. The root of F, the 6th of F, that's the 6th note in the F major scale, back to the root, to the flat 3 from F, up to the major third of F, which is the 3rd note in the F major scale. Let's say you're in the key of C minor though. So the C natural minor scale has the flat 3, the flat 6 and the flat 7 instead of the 3, 6 and 7 already in it. So if you were to play something that used those notes, because you have the context of the scale already, if you're talking to someone about it and they already know what those notes in the scale are, then you could get away with just saying the 3rd and they should automatically go to the flat 3 because they know that's what's in the scale already. But then let's say you use the major 3rd as a passing note. Well, then you should be clear and say the major 3rd because you've gone out of the key that you've established that you're working within. If we just go back to C major again quickly, we can also use those numbers to describe where we're beginning a chord from. So if I was to play F major, that begins from the 4th note in the C major scale. So I can call that chord number 4. If I was to play A minor, that starts from the 6th note in the scale. A is the 6th note of C major scale, so I can call that chord number 6. And then you say the type of chord afterwards. So essentially all I'm really doing is switching out the note name for the number. And we actually tend to use Roman numerals when we're talking about these numbers. If I played G major, I could say 5 major. If I played G sus4, I could say 5 sus4. If I played G7, I could say 5, 7. And using that, you could repeat the same kind of chord progression in another key. There's one more important thing to bear in mind with that. Sometimes people just say the chord number and they don't say the type of chord afterwards. And when you hear that, what people generally mean is the basic 3-note triad that you get by playing every other note in the scale. So that's playing in thirds. If we're in the key of C major and you were to play chord 4, you'd go to the 4th note of the scale, C, D, E, F, and then you play every other note in the scale. Skip G, play A, skip B, play C, and that gives you F major. When we do that, starting from every note in the scale, like this, that's going to look a bit different in other keys, remember, when we've got black notes in. But there's actually a specific pattern of chords that we get. The type of chord that starts from each degree of the scale, each number of the scale, will be the same in any key, as long as you follow that pattern of playing every other note in the scale. I'm not going to get too into that here. I'm going to do a separate video on that at some point, but basically this is the pattern that we get. So this is the default thing that people mean when they just say a chord number. Although in some more specific contexts, like the jazz world, people tend to play 7 chords most of the time anyway, so people assume that you mean a 7 if you just say chord 5, chord 2 or whatever. It would be 5, 7, 2, 7, and so on. Because they use it all the time, there's not much point saying it every time. And armed with that knowledge, you can repeat the same kind of chord progression in different keys. So you could change the key of a song, which you might want to do, for example, if a singer needs to sing a bit higher. And you can notice how loads of different songs use very similar chord progressions or variations of chord progressions, even though the patterns and things might be different and they're in different keys. Like I say, you're bringing it into one language. The obvious example you might have heard of is the 4-chord song, which is chord numbers 1, 5, 6, and then 4, which has been responsible for loads of hit songs. So that's 1, 5, 6, 4, And there's loads of songs that you can sing over the top of those chords. And when you know those chord numbers and you know your scales, you can figure out that in any other key. And when we play those chords in other keys, so the 1, the 5, the 6, and then the 4, that just means the chord that starts from the first note of the new scale, the 5th note, the 6th note, and then the 4th note of the new scale. Remember, 1, 4, and 5 are major, and 6 is minor. That means that we're going to hear the same pattern, we're going to hear the same kind of movement, and we could sing the same melodies over the top. So if we did that in F major, it's going to sound like the same pattern, just in a different range. 1, 5, 6, 4. E major, 1, 5, 6, 4. E flat major, 1, 5, 6, 4. Now imagine you've learnt 2 songs, but they were in different keys. So if you just read the chords, it would look like you'd learnt 2 completely separate things. But then you might realise that they were just using those exact same chords, 1, 5, 6, 4. Or maybe they were similar, just in a different order. All these disparate things start to feel a lot more similar. And when you know where those chords are in different keys, you can then train your ears to hear what each one sounds like. For example, the sound of the 5 chord, or this moment sounds like a 4-1 movement. And this is part of how people work songs out by ear or write songs, find the things that are in their head. The easiest way for a beginner to get that concept is to play the 1 chord in a key, which makes a piece of music sound finished. So chord 6 in that progression would naturally, that means just diatonically fitting inside the scale that we're using, would be a minor chord. But if for some reason, sometimes this happens for different kind of reasons, but you might want to change that to a major chord, you'd have to specify and say 6 major if you wanted to play A major. And similarly, sometimes you begin chords on notes that aren't in the main key that you're working in. So let's say we were in the key of C major, but I wanted to use this progression. It's actually a little chord movement you see a lot. So I began a chord from the flat 6 note of the scale, then the flat 7 note of the scale, and then back to the root of the scale. So I would literally call that flat 6, flat 7, 1. And as with a lot of things, I didn't say flat 6 major then, flat 7 major then, because often when you don't say anything, people assume you mean major. Now with stuff like that, there are sometimes other ways of analysing things to do with like changing keys and borrowing chords. That's getting deeper down the rabbit hole now. At the moment, I'm just trying to give you that basic description of how to find stuff. Sometimes you can analyze stuff in different ways, and sometimes you just have to think what's the most useful way to think about it. That's the simplest way to approach it first, and literally just to basically label things. This is where I'm starting the chord, this is the kind of chord that I'm making. And just with that information, you can figure out those chords in other keys. If I had a chord progression that went C major, D minor, E minor, I could also describe the chord movement as moving up in seconds. So we went from C to D to E. So, you know, the start of the chords moved up in seconds. You can sometimes describe things like that too. The next level then is relating what you're playing to the chord that you're on at the time. Seeing what notes you're using, describing them with numbers, seeing how those notes fit in and around the main notes from the chord that you're using, what kind of patterns you're using around those chord tones, and just labeling them and describing them with numbers. Basically exactly the same method, you just have a new starting point. So let's say we were in the key of C major, right? When we're talking about the scale, C is 1 and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But if we were on a G major chord at the time, okay, we can also describe G as 1. It's the first note of the chord. It's still the 5th note of the scale, but it's often useful to describe what's happening on the chord as well. On a G major chord, we can picture the notes from that chord, the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the octave as like our framework. And they can help us actually see the other numbers around it. So if that's the 1, we've got the 2, we can call that the flat 2, the 3rd in the chord, the flat 3, the 4th, the sharp 4, and then the 5th that's in the chord, the flat 6, the major 6, the flat 7, and the major 7. And if we ever do anything with those numbers, we've now just got a label for them we can repeat on another chord. So if we were on an F major chord, we now have the F major framework, and then we want to see what notes we've used in and around those chord tones. Again, the numbers are all going to be the same. Then we could repeat the same pattern from G onto F. Sometimes we might do a pattern on the chord. Let's use a left hand pattern as an example. So this is something that you might see in a left hand pattern. Don't worry about learning to play that. It's just the concept that I want you to get here. Well, if we describe the numbers relative to the chord that we're on, C, okay, we've got the root, the fifth, the octave, and then we're going to bounce back and forth between the fifth and then some notes up here. So we're going to go to the third. Okay, so it's the third, an octave above from where we started, back to the fifth. And then now we're using the second. Okay, so the second is not in a C major chord, is it? It has a 1, a 3, and a 5. Sometimes we can add notes onto chords though, or just play creatively with the notes around the chord if they sound good. And learning what sounds good and what you like and what you know works for different kinds of musical contexts, you can discover that by putting a label on it so you know what it is, and that label is the number. So there, that would be the second, okay? Major second specifically, but remember, if we just say second, it's kind of assumed it means major. Now, if I want to play that song in another key, or even just the next chord in the song, let's say the next chord in the song is an F major, I can do the same pattern on the F major, and then it's going to sound like the same thing repeating throughout the song, throughout the chord changes. So F major, we just copy those numbers, the root, the fifth, and then the root again, and then we go back and forth down to the fifth, up to the third. Look, there's F, 1, 1, 2, 3, down to the second, and it sounded like the same thing as this. Just with that concept, you can extend that to more and more complicated things. I'll do one more example. If I was to play a kind of bluesy sounding thing over the top of a C chord, well, my main body of the chord there is a C major, but I've done a pattern on that C, and I can describe the pattern with which numbers I'm using around the chord tones. So on this pattern, I'm going to start from the 1, and then I'm going to slide from the flat 3 to the major 3. Then I'm going to go up to the 5th. So see, I'm outlining the chord there. And then it's going to do a little pattern using the major 6th, which is a whole step above the 5th. Okay, so this is why patterns are helpful, because I can see how that shape moves around the chord. And like I say, I'm not consciously thinking about every number. I can just kind of see those numbers because I've developed a bit of familiarity with them. Now, if I want to repeat that pattern on F, start from the root of F. I slide from the flat third to the major third of F. Remember, the notes are all different now, so I need the numbers. Up to the 5th of F, so I'm now outlining the F chord. And then a whole step above the 5th to find the major 6th we used. When you spend time really recognizing your standard positions that you play chords, like root positions and your inversions and stuff, you can just see how shapes kind of fit around those things that you already recognize. So with something like that, I'm kind of visualizing that C major chord, and then it's just a slight adjustment, sliding from there, and then I go above there and back. And the same on the F. I've got that framework, sliding from there and go above there and come back. If I did that on an E flat major chord, I can picture that E flat chord straight away because I'm used to it. And I can see that's the third, slide from a half step below, which is the flat 3. Up to the 5th, that's already in my framework I can picture. Then a whole step above the 5th is going to be C. It's important to remember that you can extend that idea to anything. This number system isn't an instant way to suddenly seeing everything on the keyboard. It still takes experience to actually convert those numbers, see them unfolding on the piano quickly, to see those shapes and patterns. At the very beginning, it's going to be like breaking it down and analyzing it and figuring it out slowly. And eventually it just becomes more and more natural, and you can keep up with more complicated things. Everyone's going to have their kind of level with which they could do stuff instantly. I have a level with which I could transpose and play something in any key pretty much straight away. But then it gets to a certain point, and I'm not going to be able to do it instantly. I just have the tools to be able to figure it out, and it might take me a little while to do it. You may come up against technical issues because the shapes and the keys make it more difficult to play certain things. And lastly, whilst this is a really important thing to be working on and to be doing, you don't always have to think about stuff like this in loads of detail. It's just a tool to have in your tool belt to help you when you need it.